Hello, my beautiful doves. My name is Mina, and today we're going to be talking about dieting. I don't know if you guys made any New Year's resolutions this year. I think mine is just to learn French. I've been on Duolingo for about a week now, and I've been doing it every day. And I sound like a little bit better than Emily from Emily in Paris.
Merci. Have a bonne journée.
While I was thinking about New Year's resolutions and trying to come up with my own list of resolutions, I was thinking about how some of the most common ones tend to be like, oh, I'm going to exercise more, which really should be my resolution, but here we are. Another really popular one is to lose weight. And I get it. It's plague year number 3 we're going into, and most of us don't go out as often as we used to. A lot of us who would be going into the office are now working remotely at home, sitting around in pajamas with adjustable waistbands all day. And also, we've just survived Thanksgiving and the holiday season, so yeah, I understand why this is a very popular New Year's resolution for a lot of people. But then I got to thinking about society's obsession with losing weight to begin with. So what I have found, I'm going to share with you all, and it's a lot. It's a lot, so let's dive in. Thank you, Ritual, for sponsoring this video. So speaking of New Year's resolutions, if you want a simple and easy goal to achieve, you can try incorporating a daily multivitamin into your routine to support your foundational health. Ritual multivitamins provide key nutrients we need on a daily basis. Every day, you take 2 capsules that provide 9 high-quality nutrients with no shady additives, fillers, or colorants. I like Ritual above other multivitamins out there because I appreciate the transparency they have about the ingredients they use. You should know everything about the things you put in your body, and Ritual even takes it a step further and tells you where they source their nutrients from and the environmental impact behind these choices. The vitamins are vegan-friendly, non-GMO, gluten-free, allergen-free, and contain no added sugar. Ritual also currently offers a women's multivitamin, a men's multivitamin, a 50+, prenatal, postnatal, teen vitamins, and even proteins. They have a subscription service that delivers a bottle to your door once a month. Right now, Ritual is offering 10% off your first 3 months, and you can use my link down below or my code MINALEE to get started today. Also, just as a disclaimer, this video will be talking about dieting practices and we'll be discussing fat phobia. So if those are triggering topics for you, I recommend you skip out this time. So let's start in the 19th century. I know a lot of you who've been watching my videos are like, Mina, why do we keep starting in the 19th century?
It's because a lot happened, okay?
Most historians will agree that the late 19th century is when the dieting craze started. But that's not to say that people weren't dieting or there weren't like anti-fat campaigns before the 19th century. I believe the earliest documented public anti-fat campaign was in the 1670s in Europe. But it's important to note that back then, and really up until the 20th century, having a little bit of weight was a good thing. Like thinness was associated with starvation, disease, poverty. Fatness, on the other hand, was associated with health, longevity, beauty. And so, needless to say, these early anti-fat protests were largely ignored by the public. It was then in the 18th century in Great Britain that obesity started to become classified as a medical problem, and this coincided with just a larger cultural debate on conspicuous consumption. For those of you who don't know what that is, conspicuous consumption is basically when you just buy things or consume things for the sake of showing off your status and wealth, not because you actually need those things. So like think of a guy driving a Ferrari in New York City, you know? Or in this case, if we're going to relate it to food, ordering everything on the menu even though you couldn't possibly eat everything. Early advice manuals for gentlemen warned about the dangers of overindulgence, of overeating, saying that it was unmanly, ungentlemanlike, and un-English. And yes, you heard me, I did say unmanly because back in the 19th century, dieting was mainly a man's problem. There was also an article published in 1855 that argued about how being overweight was the plight of the upwardly mobile. This article was talking about how old money people, like people who were born into riches and wealth, they from a young age learned about the dangers of living comfortably and developed these control mechanisms to prevent them from like overindulging. The new money man, on the other hand, aka the man who was getting money for the first time thanks to his employment, he was at risk. The article said, "The new money man has no other resource, no hunting or cricket to take up his attention, no lectures to attend, and the consequence is that beer and tobacco commences the day, and tobacco and spirits wind it up. Such a man suddenly finds all his energies going, his mind dull and enfeebled, his body weak, flabby, and bloated." So we can see that a lot of the 19th century discourse around dieting was mainly to push men into being better members of society and to get rid of their vices. On a more subconscious level, historians Keith Waden and T.J. Jackson Lears have both suggested that as the US became more urban, fast-paced, and homogenous, people dieted or controlled their bodies as a means to cope with their anxieties about this new chaos. In the mid-19th century, there was also this growing concern that men and women were becoming too similar, like men were becoming too feminine. With the growth of the bourgeoisie class and the managerial class, there was now a whole group of men that would, in a previous century, have been laboring in the fields, but were now sitting in these very sedentary professions. And God forbid, they were getting a little fatter. The soft body was stereotyped as being a very feminine trait. At the same time, there's also this paranoia that women were becoming a little bit too masculine because women were starting to become educated. Women were starting to participate in politics. So now there was this anxiety to further separate the genders again. This consequently led to a new fitness culture that promoted manly outdoor exercise and sports. Then, in 1863, William Banting published the first best-selling diet guide in the US, called A Letter on Corpulence. The guide was aimed at men, of course, and suggested a diet regimen that featured food associated with masculinity, wealth, and racial superiority, like red meat and alcohol, and required men to eat 4 meals a day. Banting was also a believer of this very, not true, not scientifically backed idea that being overweight was a personal problem. It wasn't hereditary, and if you had enough willpower, you could will the fat away. As for women, whatever dieting advice existed out there was initially ignored. In an 1865 issue of Harper's Weekly, a diet expert complained that overweight young women could not be convinced to diet for anything, even in cases in which their weight severely impaired them, because they were only interested in having fun, sleeping in, and spending time with young men. The beauty ideal for women was actually at its softest and heaviest between the Civil War and the early 1890s, because plumpness was once again associated with very positive traits like motherhood, respectability, and sexual availability. On the other hand, thinness was also associated with a lack of fertility. And you're gonna love this one. A text from 1893 suggests that women eat a third less as soon as they turn 45 years old. You hear that? Once the clock strikes midnight, because their ovaries shrivel up and no longer need to be fed. We don't feed our bodies to get fuel or energy for the day. We feed our bodies so that our ovaries can get enough fuel to create children. Oh, Victorian doctors. Believe it or not, there were even publications to help women gain weight, such as the very popular 1878 guide, How to Be Plump. Of course, it would be a total oversimplification to say that no woman was dieting in the 19th century. If a woman did diet, it was done in private, and we don't really know because of that, how many women dieted, but we can at least see from magazine articles of the time period, there were a number of women who wrote to editors asking for dieting advice. For example, in 1868, Godey's Ladybook and Magazine published a short explanation of the Banting system, and in September 1869, Viola asked the editors of Harper's Bazaar self-help column how she could buy Banting's book in the US. Early women's rights activists also encouraged women to pay attention to their diets and also to start exercising. Rachel Brooks Gleason, one of the first female American doctors, even recommended her female patients to follow Banting's advice to gain more muscular fiber. And in an article from 1890, Eliza Putnam Heaton asserted that there is no reason why, provided she has sufficient willpower, a woman should not mold her figure to her liking. This brings us to another interesting idea. At the time, dieting could be considered to be a tool of bodily control, a tool of rebellion. Rather than only men being able to diet, women were asserting that they also had the self-control to do this too. And this may sound really dumb and arbitrary for modern day people, but at the time, like, we have to consider the climate, the social climate, you know? There were some women who chose to fast, and these fasting women were viewed as having supernatural powers, or being clairvoyant, because it was just so strange for a woman to have the same self-control as men. By 1896, the Boston Daily Globe reported that dieting had become the craze for women. And it goes without saying that as the slimmer figure started becoming in vogue, the rounder, stouter figure started to become out of vogue. Katharina Vester said in her article on dieting in postbellum America, in this cultural climate, Jewish women, immigrant or American-born, were often imagined as overweight, which increased the pressure on them to control their body weight in the attempt to gain assimilated middle-class status. This pressure is possibly why the American Jewess, the first English magazine for Jewish women, published expert dieting advice several years before other women's magazines endorsed the topic. Similarly, Black women were also targeted. The mammy caricature was artificially fattened up in popular culture, and this body was also a symbol of revisionist history of a South that had fed and treated its enslaved people generously. Of course, people are built in all shapes and sizes regardless of race or ethnicity, but these stereotypes serve to prove how society deliberately tried to exclude Black women and other like non-WASP women from ever being viewed as beautiful in the popular culture. While the origins of dieting started in the 19th century, really, a lot of historians do say that dieting as this aesthetic craze didn't come about until the early 20th century. And what I mean by that is that in the 19th century, dieting was more associated with good health, but historian Roberta Said notes that the first significant thinness craze was between 1919 and 1935. I want to take a look at a case study at Smith College, a women's college, to show you guys how cultural norms shifted over a couple decades. But first, we have to really understand what it was like there at the end of the 19th century. In the late 1800s, female students were actually encouraged to gain weight. And this is because it was essential for college women to appear healthy in the eyes of society. Critics of women's higher education claimed that academic life would destroy female health, and they used scientific backing, scientific in quotation marks, please note this, that using your brain would usurp the body's finite resources and deplete the female reproductive system of blood, nutrients, and energy. Yes, everything goes back to the reproductive system. They basically claim that college women would become infertile at the cost of higher education, and the human race would die out if too many women decided to get educated. So weight gain was supposed to show that women were actually healthy in these learning environments. One student, Charlotte Wilkinson, wrote to her mother in February 1892 that it was her ambition to weigh 150 pounds. So this was the late 1800s. By the 1920s, if we look at the letters that college students wrote to their families or their diary entries, we start to see that now they were focused on reducing. Reducing was the term for losing weight, and at this time, it meant mostly cutting out sweets and starches, working out more, and not snacking in between meals. But of course, you know, with any kind of dieting craze, there were people who took it to an extreme, and it manifested in very unhealthy practices. For instance, student Dorothy Dushkin wrote an entry in May 1922 saying, "Resolved once more to cut down my diet. Betty and Fran's chief topic of conversation is dieting. It is extremely wearisome, especially since they are both slender. I shall try once again to exert my willpower. I'm not going to say a word about it. I'm not going to foolishly cut meals and starve on certain days and relax on others as they do, but attend all meals and refrain from eating between meals." And in 1920, college physician Florence Gilman wrote, "Never have we had such a large proportion of seniors who are tired, nervously tense, underweight, anemic, with low blood pressure, showing a condition of depressed vitality. These things are found in students who have not been ill for the most part." So what shifted? Why were these students who 20 years ago would have been trying to gain weight, why are they now losing weight? Well, on a larger societal level, according to anthropologist Claire Cassidy, slenderness symbolized the freedom from want. The wealthy are able to switch the bodily metaphor of success from fat to thin because they do not need to worry about famine or infectious disease. They can go beyond the message of fat, look how much abundance I have, to a more etheric model. I'm so safe, I can afford to ignore abundance. But it's important to note that most of these college students didn't write in their diary entries with this level of class consciousness. Most of them wrote about how they wanted to lose weight because they wanted to look better or because all their friends were doing it. With that said, a major reason for this dieting craze was men. Up until 1910, college was mainly homosocial, as in girls would hang out with other girls, have parties with other girls, etc. However, by the 1910s, students would bat, which was a term that referred to groups of students and their usually male guests motoring to a rural off-campus spot to picnic. Early Smith students also used the term date to mostly refer to hanging out with a friend, usually another woman, but by the 1920s, the term date almost always referred to going out with a man. Historian Beth Bailey notes that dating moved courtship into the public world, relocating it from family parlors and community events to restaurants, theaters, and dance halls. And unlike courting, the goal of dating was not necessarily to get married, but to raise your popularity status. And to get more dates, you needed to look your best. And looking your best in the 1920s meant following the very thin flapper look and wearing the most fashionable clothes. But unfortunately, if you were fat, much like today, it was harder to find fashionable clothes, especially because couture was slimming down. In a 1923 interview, French clothing designer Paul Poiret even talked about his unwillingness to dress fat women. He said, "We do not pay much attention to fat women. They are the infirm among the fashionable. We cannot do anything special for them. They have merely to trail along the path of la mode. Their case is not for the dress designer, it is for the physician."
I guess nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
And ready-made clothing, which was becoming more and more available due to industrialization, gave women an idea of what their bodies were supposed to look like and where they existed on the spectrum of available sizes. So let's talk about the flapper. Margaret Lowe claims that before World War I, there was actually a number of different beauty ideals that women could fall into. There was the natural woman who had a curvy but not extremely hourglass figure, the voluptuous woman who had an extremely hourglass figure, and the Gibson girl, which had a linear but sensuous shapeliness. There was only one beauty ideal now, the thin, straight figure. And if you couldn't mold your body to fit into that shape, then it sucks for you. You may have been hot like 10 years ago, but you're not anymore. The flapper represented youthful modernity. She was slender, flat-chested, and small-hipped. And because having any of these features is usually a genetic thing, not every girl of the 1920s looked exactly like the flapper, but they at least followed the straight silhouette thanks to the undergarments available. According to Lowe, these straight lines signaled adherence to the new sexual codes of 20s youth: dating, petting, fast dancing, and freedom from parental supervision. Another contributing factor to the slimness craze was the development of new food science. Building on mid-19th century German research, American food scientists were pushing for this idea to choose food based on its nutritional value rather than its taste and appearance. On top of recommending people to reduce fats, sugars, carbs, and proteins, they were also recommending
calorie counting.
Chin Zhao writes that this emphasis on calorie counting was in part stimulated by the US government's World War I food conservation campaign. The government was invested in conserving meat, wheat, fat, and sugar for domestic and allied troops. Because these items were calorie dense and the dry goods among them were relatively easy to ship overseas. So it was only after the war that calorie counting became a phenomenon for weight loss. You may or may not have also heard of Dr. Lulu Peters, who was an infamous diet promoter and who published numerous popular articles and books that recommended restricting calories for weight reduction. Following in her footsteps, numerous doctors also wrote to women's magazines and journals, telling women that they should count their calories not just for themselves, but for their families to keep everyone at the right weight. This all inevitably led to a larger social disdain for being fat. And the effects were devastating. In 1927, home economist Lydia J. Roberts said, "In this country, the calorie is a familiar word in the vocabulary of practically every adult, and anyone who doubts the possibility of popularizing it should observe a group of 10-year-old children counting their calories." little children were counting their calories as well. There was a girl named Dorothy who even wrote a letter to Dr. Peters in 1924 saying, "I am 11 years old and weighed 136 pounds, which was too much." And for men, because I haven't forgotten about the men, most of them who decided to calorie count were doing it to gain muscle, not to like lose weight. So now dieting for weight loss was a predominantly woman-targeted arena. Lastly, I want to talk about the post-war era, so the 1950s to 1970s, because I feel like this was the time period that really set the precedent for what dieting is today. In this era, we get diet pills, slimming clubs, and before and after photo advertisements. So yeah, let's get into that disaster. The reason why this era was such a profitable time for the dieting industry was because during the war, national interests were prioritized over individual interests. Nancy Gagliardi mentioned several factors for the diet rebirth post-war. The first is the rising middle class. Middle-class families were rebuilding their post-war lives through consumerism, and housewives, which have been primary advertising targets for a while now, became the diet industry's core demographic as well. The second reason is that food technology and marketing strategies were becoming more and more sophisticated. The mid-century was the golden age of processed foods. Artificial sweeteners appeared just about everywhere, and consumption of it rose from 5 million pounds in 1963 to 17 million pounds in 1969. The artificial sweetener market also led to a booming diet soft drink market that was valued at $660 million in 1965. The third reason is that the media, especially with the popularity of the television, was becoming more and more powerful, and constant headlines and fear-mongering programs about the nation's growing weight problem and weight-related diseases were seeping into the public consciousness. This is in part because in 1959, U.S. insurance companies published the Build in Blood Pressure Study, which at the time represented the largest body of information relating body weight to mortality. If you want more information on the obesity epidemic, I highly recommend listening to the Maintenance Phase podcast, specifically their episodes on the obesity epidemic and is being fat bad for you. But in sum, this study was bullshit. There were not enough control variables. You know, people just didn't understand statistics that well, I guess. But subsequently, this idea that being overweight led to early death was leading to a public scare. And obesity was largely pushed as being a behavioral issue. An interesting idea that I came across while reading Nancy Gagliardi's article, and I say this is interesting because I'm against dieting, just in general, but she does mention that dieting is not necessarily like a complete awful thing. There were plenty of aspects involved in the dieting process, such as planning, shopping, and cooking meals, which resulted in a sense of agency. There's also social aspects as well, like Weight Watchers, which was founded in 1963 and offered a community space for women to talk about their insecurities. Before I open the whole Weight Watchers Pandora's box, I want to talk about appetite suppressant pills or diet pills, specifically this pill called AIDS. AIDS? AIDS.
AIDS are tasty caramels for dieters. AIDS contains one of the most effective appetite suppressants you can buy, and AIDS contains no stimulant.
So why don't you let AIDS help you lose weight and keep it off?
AIDS helps you stay the way you want to be.
Ads for this pill were the first of the 20th century to use the before and after weight loss story template, involving the stories of real women, written in first person, of course, and using emotionally descriptive, dramatic language. This was powerful and is still a go-to advertising strategy for diet companies today, but the reason it was so powerful in the mid-20th century is because before this time period, women who were dealing with problems were told to just keep it in. And especially for fat issues, a lot of women, prior to these ads, were just not visible. Nidich and Heilman wrote of the social stigma for fat people at the time. You never see fat people. They never go outside, they stay home because they can't walk without getting out of breath, and they can't climb on a bus. You never see them at the movies because the seats are too small. They don't even go shopping because people laugh. Diet pills were not necessarily new. They were prescribed for weight loss as early as the 1930s, but by 1949, sales climbed to $7.3 million and continued to rise through the 1950s as competition increased.
Ladies, stay fit and trim the easy way.
with amphetamines, the pleasantest way to reduce.
The market for appetite suppressants was estimated to generate $153 million in retail sales in 1960. And whether most of these worked is up for debate. If you watched Mad Men, you'll remember the Relaxicizer. That was a real thing, like a vibrating belt that was supposed to help you lose weight. Sounds like a scam to me. So let's get into Weight Watchers and other slimming clubs. I don't know if the structure of Weight Watchers has changed since the 60s, but at the time, the business offered classes that gave weight loss guidance, tailored food plans, a weekly weigh-in where women would have to weigh themselves on a scale in front of the class, and the emotional support of fellow slimmers. The experience was, of course, different for everyone. I did come across testimonials of women who liked their experience just because it offered a time for them to address their own feelings and to get solidarity from fellow women. Other women, like a woman named Jackie, who was part of Weight Watchers in the 1980s, said that the classes could be a bit cringeworthy and it could be also humiliating and shameful if at the weekly weigh-in you didn't lose any pounds or you gained another pound. In the fall of 1967, Weight Watchers UK held a fashion show at Bentel's department store. It was a promotional event that included huge blow-ups of the models' before pictures so that viewers could see how different they looked now. Leah Kent criticized the transformation trope, writing for the book The Body Ready. The fat person, usually a fat woman, is represented not as a person but as something encasing a person, something from which a person must escape. And it's important to also tell you guys that the slimming clubs had very not good rates of success. From a survey conducted in 1975, 63% of the participants regained some of their lost weight and 16% reverted back to their before weight. These slimming clubs did not care about changing the lifestyles of women, about raising their self-esteem and body image to prevent them from getting into these like binge behaviors. Instead, they just focused and prioritized this arbitrary number that was supposed to represent like premium objective health for all women.
She thinks, well, I'm fat and I need to lose weight, not, something's going on in my brain.
Right.
And maybe the solution here is a brain thing and not a body thing.
Like, you can be alarmed by your binge eating behavior and try to work on that behavior in a way that is not necessarily about weight loss or about seeing yourself as a fundamentally failed person.
And yes, there were a minority of men who did participate in these slimming clubs as well, but Bernice Weston, the founder of Weight Watchers UK, recollects that men frequently said they joined for medical reasons or because they were frightened when one of their friends died from a heart attack. Women were more likely to say that they hated the way they looked. So here we are today. Some things have changed, even though there are still staggering eating disorder cases and numbers of women who have very low self-esteem because of their weight. I feel like we are crawling towards progress thanks to the work of activists who promote body acceptance. Though the BBL trend did set us back a couple years, but progress doesn't go like this. Progress goes like this. As for my personal opinion on diets, as I've said, I don't like diets. And I understand that's a very general statement because there's a number of dieting practices out there and not all of them are scams probably. But I think it's a problem that diets tend to mostly appeal to people with already low self-esteem. And I think if you go into a diet with low self-image, with low body image, you're going to be prone to developing an eating disorder. The National Eating Disorders Association even released a statement in 2019 as a response to the Weight Watchers app, saying, in a large study of 14 and 15-year-olds, dieting was the most important predictor of developing an eating disorder. Those who dieted moderately were 5 times more likely to develop an eating disorder, and those who practiced extreme restriction were 18 times more likely to develop an eating disorder than those who did not diet. Also, a lot of dieting programs, they utilize this negative body talk, which is just not healthy.
As of 2011, 93% of women reported engaging in social quote-unquote fat talk.
Yeah.
Which they sort of define as this practice of expressing dissatisfaction with their own size or talking about quote-unquote feeling fat, right?
Right.
People who engage in this kind of fat talk have significantly weaker romantic relationships and friendships. So relationships of all stripes are weakened by this. Weight Watchers is a place that has sort of systematized and participated in the popularization of this phenomenon, right?
I also think there's a lot of truth about what Naomi Wolf has written about women being overly concerned with their appearances. She's written about how American women, whenever they achieve greater status in society, there are pressures that force them to consider their appearances a little too much, which ends up distracting them from achieving economic and financial success at the same rate as their male peers. So yeah, food for thought. That's all I have for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about dieting, what you think about these trends, whether you think they work, whether you're against them, for them. I'd love to hear what you all have to say. And thank you for spending this piece of your day with me. And I'll see you next time. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.